with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Wynn Anderson, who is a 42-year resident of Guemes Island. And his interest in history began really since he moved there, which was related to the fact that his property that he first purchased belonged to some of the first homesteaders on Guemes Island, the Matthews family. So then, as many of you know, he bought property near the ferry landing, which was also the first commercial property that homesteaders ran. So Wynn has always been self-employed, except for the 10 years he worked as a journalist in Portland and Tacoma, and he is also one of the founding members of Guemes Historical Society, which began in 2002. So I'm sure that some of Wynn's background as a journalist has certainly supported his process of digging into the complicated and maybe mythical background of Smuggler Kelly. So I know we're all really excited to hear about it, so thank you very much, Wynn.
I'd like to introduce my wife, Elaine, sitting here. She always props me up when I start to fall. And I got into this partly because the Skagit Land Trust has recently purchased Kelly's Point, which is where Smuggler Kelly lived for a time and owned property. And they wanted to know a little bit about the namesake. So I started collecting some material, and it evolved into this presentation. And I'll start out with just a little bit about smuggling. The art of Kelly's style of smuggling separates the perpetrator from the other forms of law breaking. No one is hurt. Transactions are mutually acceptable. The smuggler is regarded in many quarters with good-natured tolerance, said one observer. In many minds, smuggling is a species of lawbreaking over which the Ten Commandments have no jurisdiction. Author James McCurdy, he wrote here around the turn of the 20th century, a book called Crisscross Over the Boundary, and he had this to say: censure them as we may and should, we cannot help a thrill of admiration as we read of the courage, the determination of these men who, choosing the darkest, stormiest nights, brave the sullen waters in their miniature vessels when none other craft of their tonnage would be abroad. McCurdy admired Kelly and appears to have presented him with the name King of the Smugglers. And this is the way he described him. In his prime, he was the most persistent and successful smuggler that ever operated single-handedly on these waters. And I think the key word there, 2 words, single-handed. It's just amazing what this man did with what he had. Lawrence Kelly wasn't called King of the Smugglers based on the volume or value of his imported booty, nor was it for his commanding presence. He was well under 5 foot 6 inches tall, and he was a piker compared to the big boys. In their hands, romance was out. Their 19th century steamboats, hidden among legal cargo, they were doing far more illicit business on single trips, delivering Chinese refined opium, silk, woolens, and whiskey in more bulk than Kelly could ever dream of. The customs agents also got into the action, much to Kelly's dismay. It was simply unfair competition, especially since they had the power of arrest. Kelly was considered an honorable, non-violent smuggler who gave up peacefully when apprehended, except notably in one case that I'll get to later. In the end, his chosen profession cost him hefty fines, considerable time in prison, loss of his family and property over the latter half of 47 years. What made the king stand out in the public's view was his good-natured audacity, operating alone with no more than a set of sails and oars and a unique knowledge of his tricky, sometimes treacherous home waters. The record shows that he ran at least 3 different vessels: the unnamed Red Hull, one or more Whitehall boats, and the famous Katy Thomas. Photo 2. Yeah, that's a Whitehall. Whitehalls were the most refined rowboats of the 19th century, ranging in length up to 25 feet, and they're valued to this day for their many perfected attributes: speed, capacity, and simple beauty. Next photo. Well known in the San Juans, the Katy Thomas, Kelly's most popular vessel, was built in 1894 on Fishery Point, Waldron Island, by Ashton Thomas and his brothers Ellery and John. A pinky type, she was 8 tons gross, 38 feet long, with 12 feet of beam. She was named for Ashton's wife, Catherine, who sewed the sails. The boat was used in the Waldron fishery and was a noted fast sailor. Katy was sold after the Alaska Gold Rush and passed through many ownerships, including Kelly, and finally, in her declining years, an ex-GI named Hans Wold in 1955. Next photo now. This is a rare image of Katy Thomas under sail. Her shape and sail carrying gave her an advantage in hard weather. I want to thank the group, especially those in back, for not holding their own conversations. I appreciate it very much. These are the lines of the Katy that were taken off the boat by Guemes Islander Kenny Powell as it sat on the bank of the Ship Harbor boat graveyard. Number 6 is the sail plan. That's also done by Kenny. And finally, this shows Katy's remains on the harbor. Many of you saw that boat. It was there till 1979. This photo was taken by Kurt Hansen. I don't know who he is, but he took this picture in 1974. And this is the wreck that shipwright Kenny had to measure to get the lines. Okay, now let's go to, that's good. This picture was taken at Cap Santa Marina by, reported by the name of Farmer Dirks of the American Bulletin. And as a parentheses here, one of the headlines in Dirks' 4-part series referred to Kelly as Pirate Kelly in the headline. I won't blame Dirk for that. It was probably done on the city desk by mistake. At any rate, the boat was there. Dirk found out that it had belonged to Smuggler Kelly and was very interested, so he wrote 4 different episodes. And the next one is the one we were looking at. Hans Wold, W-O-L-D. He was a World War II veteran, and Dirk got him to pose holding the steering wheel from the Katy Thomas. And this is the last picture that we know of that the boat was still in the water. And then it comes the next one that we've already seen, Kurt Hansen's photo. And demolition took place in 1979, and guess who showed up? Photo. Bill Mitchell. Somehow, through dedication to the past and pure cussedness when hot on the trail of historic importance, Bill managed to transport a small section of the hull planking, actually more than one now I find out, to add to his collection at home. And that's where first saw it and took that picture, and I fell in love with the artistic value of that ancient planking and some of the changes that have been made over the many years. And next photo, I think it's 11. And this is the whole, most of the piece. I actually cut part of it off. It was over 100 pounds when I got it, and I had trouble moving it around. But you can see this is the above the water line, and these original planks are actually below the water line. These are replacements, it looks like. But this section has a lot to tell. It's a virtual storyboard. But even more interesting is the next one. And this is the backside of that piece. And you can see the frames. Some of them are original, apparently, that have been steam bent in place. Others are added on. And there's even a piece of plywood jammed in here. It's amazing. The sad signs of desperation by some perplexed boatwright trying to work inside the cramped quarters, trying to give her a few more months or days, or maybe just enough to get her out of the water. Next photo. This is part of Bill Mitchell's collection as well. Of course, that collection never ends. But these are containers for personal use of opium, and Bill said that a good place to find them is around the sites of the now long gone Chinese barracks at Ship Harbor. I'm going to give you a quick, truncated version of Kelly's biography. He was born in 1839. Everybody hear me? Born in 1839 in either Ireland or England, he arrived in New Orleans as the Civil War was beginning and enlisted with the Louisiana Tigers. After his discharge from the Confederate Army, he arrived in Puget Sound about 1864 in the ship Young America, vowing never to earn an honest dollar under the Stars and Stripes. In that goal, he never foundered. His business spanned nearly 47 years. In retirement, he contacted the Louisiana chapter of the Daughters of Confederacy, and they kindly lined him up with a soldier's home. His obituary appeared in the Bellingham Herald in 1926. He was 87 years old. I don't have a copy of that obituary, but we'll get one. Next photo, customs officer arriving in this wild, lightly populated area. Kelly made note of the voids and weaknesses in border policing. He immediately began his chosen profession and lived a charmed life. For at least the first 20 years. His business was not seriously interrupted until 1886, when agents began to tighten up. I love this Mitchell mural, which just seems to be growing out of the earth with some higher power or purpose in mind. It also complements the plodding, dawdling reputation of early customs vessels. Kelly was new in 1886. He was nabbed with 40 cases of Canadian whiskey. He must have been in shock. Many times over the years, he had been intercepted by inspectors, but usually evaded arrest. One trick was to anchor his cargo to a float for later pickup. Another scheme was to place his opium in a weighted sack, opium floats, as it turns out, and toss it over with a rope attached to the ring bolt below the waterline. Well, that worked for a while. It worked until the late 19th century when one inspector keel-hauled the boat, discovering the hidden hoard of 567 tins of opium, a fortune. The result of that misstep was Kelly's first trip to McNeil Island Federal Prison. Kelly married Native American Lizzie Coots in 1877. She was the daughter of Charles Coots, sheriff of Whatcom, which included Skagit, from 1968 to 72. That may have been a match made in heaven with her father being the sheriff, I don't know. Their first home was on Guemes Island, property he owned from 1872 to 78 at Southwest Point that bears his name, and they later moved to Sinclair Island, where Kelly served for a time as a school board member. Lizzie was also involved in Kelly's work. On one occasion, she and a friend were tasked with carrying a couple of suitcases by train south. They were admonished to keep the luggage in their control. When they reached the stopover in Seattle, the temptations of the big city were too great. They went shopping. They left the heavy burdens on the train. On their return, they were nabbed. I have lost the source of this undated anecdote and the follow-up details, but I have never found nor heard of any report of Lizzie ever being in custody. Kelly's next brush with the law in 1904 almost killed him. This broke his record of cooperation with agents. It was also on a train, a southbound train. He was spotted by an inspector, and they found 60 pounds, usual contraband. He was arrested and put on a northbound train for Sumas to be indicted. He broke free and leaped from the train at full speed, which might have been 30 miles an hour then. But at any rate, his captors picked him up unconscious, no broken bones, and after a cash bond of $750 changed hands, he was back in business. The following year, 1905, he was nicked again. Times are getting tough. This time he was sailing a small sloop near Vashon. Officials that chased him for a couple of days expressed surprise that he risked his arrest for a mere 60 pounds. Kelly complained he bought all he could, he said, with very limited means, and at that he was sentenced for 2 more years in prison. On his early release, he always got an early release, good prisoner, declared he was getting too old for the business and would mend his ways. But by 1910, he was in jail in Seattle, this time based on a pathetic 15-pound bust. But he wasn't done yet. It's hard to break with the thrills and rewards of the past. In May 26th of 1911, the San Juan Islander carried a story about Kelly's boat at anchor near Orcas, I believe, where a resident watched from her window as the Border Patrol boat rounded the point and approached Kelly's vessel. Agents tied up for a detailed, thorough search. Nothing was found, much to the 72-year-old Kelly's amusement as he sat on deck, smoking and smiling. By this time, federal law forbade the importation of all opium. Canada, partly at the request of mainland China, Canada helped remove the scourge by closing down factories at Victoria, but it had the effect mainly of boosting the value from $100 to $400 a pound. But by that time, Kelly was truly out of the illicit picture. I want to make a note that Kelly, in some sources, has been confused possibly with someone as colorfully named as Jim Pig Iron Kelly, same last name, a more notorious smuggler. Lawrence Kelly was rumored to have drowned smuggled Chinese workers while fleeing the law in panic. The rumors may have been transferred from Pig Iron's legacy or some other smuggler. It's hard to say. At any rate, the rumors failed the reality test. Imagine the logistics of a single helmsman maintaining control over a boatload of human cargo, even if they were tied up and weighted with scrap iron. R.M. Becker, a Fidalgo Island pioneer and acquaintance of Lawrence Kelly, vehemently denied that it was possible. A kinder-hearted man never lived, he said. Kelly was known to drop illegal passengers off at remote locations for later retrieval under pressure by authorities. There is a known incident witnessed at Square Harbor where a friendly visiting friend, he was a friend, met up with Kelly and was treated to the unforgettable scene when Kelly at anchor shouted out to the woods, "All clear, John." Around the bay, the brush began to rustle, and the heads of maybe a dozen illegal immigrants started popping up. The event went a long way towards cementing Kelly's reputable humanity. He was known to keep his word and to pay his bills. One item that we have is a note from Monk's store that Kelly wrote, scribbled on a scrap of paper, asking Monks to continue providing credit to Lizzie in Kelly's planned absence, and that was accepted as good as money. And I should say, Kelly was often more honest with officials and judges than he really needed to be, in my opinion. Let's go to the next photo. This has been described as Kelly's hideout on Kelly's Point. Has anybody seen that before? Yeah, shaking your heads. Raise your hand if you have. Okay. Well, the Schreider family is not so sure. Next. The back side of this picture has the following notation. This is the first house built on Guemes Island by Saul Schreiber and stands today on my mother and father's farm. It is framed in the memory of our 18th wedding anniversary, August 19th, 1932, Bernice, Gerald, and Deanna. It's wonderful that they annotated the photograph, but I wish they would have just added a few more details, which we'll have to chase down. But it brings to light another possibility for the previous picture. Number 17, we're going to go to Guemes Island. This is, the main thing here is the wharf. It's believed to be the first built on Fidalgo or Guemes Island. And it dates to 1877, which we have verified. And you can see how the rough-hewn planks are being laid down and the framework for holding it up, plus the anchor point in the back made of logs and field stones. The most abundant natural island resource. Field stones and fir trees, they were just in the way. So they didn't have pile drivers, 1877. This is the way they made that first wharf. It is the site of the first working post office, that one in that little shack up there, and store on Fidalgo or Guemes. The Yankee Doodle didn't start serving Anacortes by boat until 1890. Notably, 1872 to 78 was the period Lawrence owned his property, and he probably knew the Mangans, that undoubtedly did. He had a boat. He could have used the mail boat service and maybe some manpower to help clear and build, and even to buy lumber, because it looks like they had a mill that was creating all this stuff. And I believe that he would have shopped locally. Now, The photo's a little difficult to see detail besides the size and a lot of lighting here. But I counted, let's see, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and one in back, 8, 9, and there's a 10th one. Can anybody see it? Carolyn?
Someone on the lower shore, is that a person? Right there?
This right here? Looks like a hoodie,
Yeah.
looks like a canoe paddle, looks like the prow of an Indian canoe. It took me looking at that picture maybe a dozen times or more before I picked that up. So thank you, Carolyn.
It's because it's blown up nice and big.
But it is the first, it's the earliest known image of a Native American on Guemes. There were natives still on the South Shore and on the West Shore, but this is just a spectacular picture. And by the way, the wharf was created below the future store building, which is north of the wharf, just in a direct line for convenience. So the small building was still continued to be used by as the post office by Flora Mangan, and she also took in boarders and room and board, should I? She was a busy woman. Now I'm going to blow your mind over history and archaeology, which are so tightly related. Off the subject a little bit, but I'm going to try to tie them together. Next photo. This is a fellow by the name of Willie Mcwaters. He's the manager of the current store on Guemes. And Willie got interested because he saw a picture of that wharf, a different one from a distance. It wasn't actually the wharf. It was the rubble of rocks that were remaining from the wharf. And I told him that I had figured out that had to be the location of the first wharf. So he took a walk down there. I had walked that beach maybe 300 times. I never saw anything. But Willie, on his first or second trip, see the end of that log up there is kind of white? That's where the bark is worn off. And that's what was sticking out. And he started excavating a little bit and found that the mortise and tenon, and there are actually a couple, they're not visible because of darkness, but there are a couple of what they call tree nails or trunnels, wooden nails that held those things in place. Now, as pictured, it could be 142 years old, or it may have been part of a later rebuild, but it is not recent. The wharf photo shows where Kelly may have tied up. That's why that's my tie-in with Kelly. But this image defines the exact location of the wharf. It is the only recognizable wooden artifact that we on Guemes have from that era. It's 98% buried in the mid-tide range, preserved perfectly in clay, gravel, and brackish water. It's surrounded by the scattered stone debris from the original wharf. And it was just discovered last year. And thank you, Willie Mcwaters, for being curious and finding it. Photo number 19. This is a picture of Kenny Powell and his wife at the time out on the sailboat that he did build. And I just wanted to get a shout out for him for taking the lines off the Katy before it was destroyed. And that concludes my presentation.